Can you guys hear me? Cool, sweet. All right, I get tired of holding a microphone, and I took a new step in my nerddom and got a clicker. So we're gonna try and see how this goes. So today we're gonna talk about multi-user testing strategies with Playwright. A simpler way of putting that is being able to simulate multiple users doing different things or the same things on the same website or web application so that you can validate your apps and the more complex features that they hold. So a little bit about me. I have a bachelor's and master's in software engineering. I got it from Loyola University Chicago with focuses in computer crime and forensics and communication studies. I'm formerly a member of Startup Culture. So for those of you trying to get a company off the ground, I empathize. Currently, I'm a senior architect here in the software engineering capability here at Slalom. My specializations include modern web, serverless and event-driven architecture, functional programming, and cybersecurity. So why are we here? We're going to go over some Playwright basics, and then we're going to go over customizing your user context so that you can have better control over your browser and its state. And then we're going to go over some multi-user basics, some very simple patterns that I came up with to get this concept foundational. And then we're going to bring it all together with a case study that some of you guys are aware of. Cool. Playwright 101. So this is an end-to-end testing framework and toolkit. And it's very easy to use, in my opinion. I've used a few different end-to-end frameworks. I really enjoy using this framework as opposed to a lot of other testing frameworks. They're kind of a pain in the butt. And let's be honest, it discourages some of us from writing tests. So Playwright, though, enables you to simulate user interaction, mock browser contexts, both engine, state, all those kinds of things, viewport sizes, and even simulate slow internet connections. This is really good for responsive and mobile devices and things like that. You can also do session tracing and recording, tracing that it tracks the state of the browser and the DOM and all of the attributes of your storage as it goes through the entire testing flow. And then you can look at this in a pretty, I think, usable UI, and we'll get to that later. Lastly, it supports all major browser engines. By just passing a single flag, you can instantiate any of these. You will notice that we have Safari on here, which is powered by the WebKit engine. That is a proprietary engine owned by Apple, both fortunately or unfortunately. And so that is something that you do need to be using an Apple device to run that on. I don't think there's an easy way of doing it on Linux or Windows. If you figure it out, let me know. It's also maintained in multiple languages. So any of these languages here, even though this is TypeScript and JavaScript, folks, you could really use it for any of the main stacks that a lot of people use. So customizing your browser context. So when you instantiate a browser context, you have a lot of control over the kinds of things that it's going to leverage. First off, there's a device configuration registry. It has a certain amount of devices that it will just drop all the default configurations for that device. The kinds of engine that it uses, the viewport size, and the kinds of permissions that you might expect or not expect within that device. So it's not an exhaustive list of devices, but it's a nice starting point if you just want to run some simulations across a number of different devices. You can do that pretty easily using a pattern and injecting something from their device config registry. You can also simulate locale and time zone. That's obviously pretty handy if you're doing things like localization, internationalization, or having any sort of geolocation is also supported. Permissions. Most people don't think about permissions in the browser. You do have to request permissions for things. You can simulate that as well. So if you have a feature that's reliant on a user giving you an initial grant or an allowance of a certain escalation of permissions on their device, then that is a great way to do it. Storage state. Browser has a few different storage mechanisms, as we know. We have local storage, session storage, cookie storage, IndexedDB. You can mock pretty much all of that, however you want, which is pretty nice. We're going to touch on the last part. Believe it or not, some people, myself included in this room, have spent a lot of time figuring this out in the last couple of weeks. Thank you, Brian. And we just did this for a client. Auth patterns differ. This gets tricky. So I went over a few different ways that you can mock authentication. Custom cookie declaration. HTTP-only cookies are common use for ID, access, and refresh tokens. So you can do it that way. I would recommend use HTTP only. Please do not put your credentials somewhere that the client can access them. You can initialize local storage. Don't put your token here, put a flag here, something. Anything but your authentication credentials, please. Header injection. You can directly inject new headers into the request that your browser is making. This is, while kind of simple, I think this is my favorite. I think it's pretty sweet that you can just kind of inject that stuff into any of the requests that your browser context is attempting to execute. I find that pretty handy. And so I just listed a few examples of like the kinds of tokens that, or excuse me, kinds of headers that you might want to inject into your browser context. Multi-user basics, browsers and context. So I keep on saying context. When you launch the browser on Playwright, it instantiates a application running behind the scenes. In order to really do anything, you need to have an instance of a browser and an instance of the page. So this is how we can leverage some of the patterns for this. Here's a really basic example of page and context instantiation in a Playwright test. The first line after the test opening and the comment declares a browser context, or excuse me, a browser page from the default browser context that's initialized with this test. This browser context is defined by the configurations that are passed to this test scenario. This could emulate your entire device. This could emulate just the browser engine. This could even mimic something about your authentication state. You can have a simple go-to call, but what we're more interested in is the next section, where you can dynamically instantiate and imperatively instantiate your own browser context and leverage it or modify it however you want. And then we're going to clean up our resources at the end. Multiple context instantiation. Multiple contexts can be leveraged so that you can manipulate different browser instances. For, in this case, I like to use it as an example of multi-user scenarios. You might want to instantiate different instances of the same or different browsers in order to get two users interacting with the same data or the same feature at the same time. This gives you a big benefit on having end-to-end coverage for more complex features. Getting more and more into end-to-end testing, we do a lot of simulation around user interaction. I was honestly kind of surprised that I hadn't seen more things around multi-user things, especially with how complex web apps have gotten. So many things that we do today require multiple people acting on an entity or a piece of data in order for it to really fulfill what we're trying to get it to do. Cool. Multiple context instantiations across different browser engines. Here, you can modify or instantiate a browser of any type by just telling Playwright which one you want to launch. This is normally done behind the scenes with your configuration object that I was referring to earlier, but this allows you to imperatively declare and instantiate a browser context that you can then use however you want. So here, as opposed to the last one where we were seeing contexts from the same browser, excuse me, this one instantiates one from Chromium and then one from Firefox. And that was relevant to me at one point. We'll get to that later. We're getting into it now. Bringing it all together. So for those of you that have seen a talk of mine before at GoTo last year, you are familiar with this, DeadDrop. DeadDrop is an end-to-end peer-to-peer secret sharing tool that I developed. It is 100% open source, and it does require two autonomous devices to be interacting in order to fulfill the basic features of the application. This introduced an interesting scenario for me when I was trying to validate it. Validating secret sharing really requires me to be able to simulate the activities of two users at one time. I was not satisfied with trying to just like mock it and stuff like that. The other options would have been like spoofing network traffic or something like that. And I really didn't want to do that. I wanted to find a way of actually running the flow every single time. And because it was built on cryptographic primitives that are leveraged from the browser, I wanted to ensure that it would work across every single browser engine. So the test suite for DeadDrop actually runs across, it defines the browser for the person dropping and the person grabbing the secret. It defaults to Chromium, as you can see on the bottom left, and it's going to iterate over the projects array that you see on the right. And it simulates drops from and to every single kind of browser, major kind of browser engine that Playwright supports. This allows me to run a single command with a single defined test. And at the end, I know that my feature works perfectly on every single kind of browser, which is really handy, especially when you're in open source and you want it to work for people. Context and page creation. So one thing that I have also spent some time doing is bypassing CAPTCHA. DeadDrop does have a CAPTCHA that I use in order to prevent hacking. So naturally, when I'm trying to simulate a bunch of traffic and mock a bunch of user interactions, I had to figure out how to hack my own app. So that was something that was a good learning experience for me around, I'd used a combination of cookies and header injection to generate cryptographic signatures that could be validated on the fly on the server and determine whether or not I wanted that user interaction to be blocked and validated by a CAPTCHA. So there's a lot of other clever things that you can do with just tinkering with the kinds of utilities that Playwright exposes to you. Modulate browser engine using the configuration. So here, as you saw, I had a config where I just had two properties. One's the drop browser, one's the grab browser, and you migrate through the engines. And you can iterate over those in any matrix or array form that you would like. Scenario step isolation. One thing that I really like about Playwright is a lot of its syntax, very clean, very readable, and it also provides for a fair amount of extensibility and atomicity. What do I mean by that? We can declaratively group certain parts of our functionality into steps. So say you have, this is the actual test for dead drop. So these steps can produce outputs that are then used in later tests. So this is a 100% isolated callback function that sets up the entire drop, the secret exchange. It validates every step. And then at the bottom, you'll see that it returns a drop link, and that gets assigned the constant at the top. This can then be used at another step. So then when you're actually trying to inject these, you can use more functional patterns. This is a functional pattern. There's also decorators and class-based, like more OOP patterns. I like functional, so this happens to be more functional. And this allows you to just pass this basic callback to your step. And now this is a reusable function that you can drop in anywhere. Anytime I need to create a drop, I can use that, pass a page, pass a secret value, and move on with my day. And it's going to follow the exact same flow that I know is getting validated whenever I need to. This is an example of the grab flow. It also has its own step, but you'll notice that first thing it does is await, grabber page, go to drop link. So the first thing it does, it takes that drop link that was created by the browser context of the other user, and it navigates to it. It's then going to try and trigger the drop and go through it. And then it grabs the value out of the inner HTML. So whatever element I'm using to render that value to you, I'm just grabbing the constants of that, returning it, and that gets assigned to the grab secret value constant at the top there. Yeah, so like I said, it provides a lot of atomicity, encapsulation, and a potential for step-based abstractions. That's not to say that you should just abstract everything out into its own function or callback or whatever, but I think it's really nice that you can just have a simple function that takes parameters of like a page and certain other values that allow you to simulate an entire step as you're moving through your logic, including fixtures. Fixtures is a new one for me, actually. Playwright has the ability to basically write middleware style hook functionality that you can configure your config with functions. So here is an example of the newest iteration of the dead drop config. This has drop browser and grab browser the same way that it did originally, but it also has drop user and grab user. You'll notice what that does is most of the logic that you saw in the setup for the original test suite. So this abstracts all of that and encapsulates it into two helper functions that run as the tests are spun up. You'll also notice that it does tear down at the bottom. It closes my context and it closes the actual browser application that's running in the runtime process. And this is really handy. Adding this pattern, I was able to go from that to that. Not only that, I don't have to clean up any resources at the end. So you can find clever ways, whether it's functional or fixture that's coming right out of the framework, to be able to extend your functionality and be able to do more complicated stuff in more encapsulated ways. So tracing. One of these might fail. I actually introduced a flaky test recently. And I was like, this is great for this talk. So one thing that I've been trying to do is find different ways of writing the same tests for this talk. So this, like I said, is the basic drop flow that you saw some screenshots of. This is an example of the fixtures that you were just looking at. And then we also have the flow redone with fixtures. Oh, I'm skipping. It's nice. I don't think it'll air out. I have rate limiting on dead drop, and that's actually what I started triggering when I was like blowing it up from my computer. So if we get an error, it's probably a rate limit one. These are going to generate outputs, snapshots that are full tracing sessions, and recordings that are little, I think it's M4V or something, videos that allow you to, hey, I'll pass this off. And then you'll see clearing test token for captcha bypass. So that was the thing I was talking about. Signed token that's cached and then validated on the fly so that you make sure that nobody's just bombarding your server. What I am more interested in, not that one, are these guys. So every single browser context that goes through this flow gets its own little video. It's very handy. This is also really good if you have good error reporting in your UI, that you can see what's happening when something wrong occurs. Or if you just need to see why something's behaving differently or renders weird on a certain screen when you're doing a certain action, this is a great candidate for that. The tracing, I think I might have actually, what was my trace command? Yeah, all right, cool. So this is an example of a single drop. So this is just the drop setup. And it goes through a 500 millisecond increment and shows how things are rendered, the order that they render them, and then all of the interactions. So this is just a recording that shows the drop setup. I have a single test suite that does the setup, and then I have another one that does the end-to-end flow with 2 users. So this is an example of the recording that gets generated by just setting up your drop. I already went through the screenshot. Okay, that's the recording part. Next steps. Cool. Like I said, authentication. Even though we've already talked about it, I put it in next steps because it's annoying and it's hard. And so spoofing authentication and being able to simulate that in a real context is tricky. So I encourage you to understand your authentication system. I would argue that most engineers don't spend enough time understanding their authentication system that protects their resources. That's part of why I liked getting into cryptography when I was in college. Refining fixtures. Find ways to clean up your tests. The cleaner your tests are, the easier it is for you to maintain them, the easier it is for you to onboard people, the easier it is for you to get people that don't want to write tests to write tests. And those are important things. So lastly, throttle network bandwidth. We live in probably the best, or one of the best internet connected countries on the planet. Not all of our users do. You cannot design applications assuming that you're going to have perfect bandwidth all the time. Please don't do that. If you do that, just assume that everyone that uses your thing is rich and that they have a perfect bandwidth that doesn't crash anytime. I think we can all agree it's probably a silly thing. So I encourage you to do that. Identify edge cases. I find when you're thinking from the perspective of more than one user, it's easier to identify edge cases. It's like, well, what happened if I edit this and then you try to edit that? I don't know. Write a test for it. What happens if I haven't given you approval to edit this and then you try to edit it? I don't know. Write a test for it. Like, these are patterns that I was genuinely curious how other people are doing. If you have patterns that you use for multi-user testing, I would love to hear about them. This was something that I started doing out of necessity, and then I really liked it. It was pretty cool. And I was like, this is honestly a lot easier than I was expecting, just spinning up different contexts and having them talk to each other, manipulate the same kind of resources and state. And yeah. Takeaways. So multi-user features need end-to-end validation too. Like I was just saying, a lot of edge cases get exposed when you consider more than one user type or just more than one person interacting with the same kind of entity. Well-planned abstractions for scenarios can take you far. One of the things that I didn't really call out is I made that functional callback abstraction for the drop. I didn't use it. I didn't end up doing it for the grab. And that was to kind of practice not being overly dry, quite frankly. I didn't want to like have duplicate functionality, but I also only test the drop part in one spot. And so I was like, cool, this is an unnecessary abstraction. And I like using tools that make me think about those kinds of things. As I was saying, consider your user's circumstances. It's not safe for you to assume that they're going to have 4G, 5G, or be pulling down 500 meg. Not everyone has a gaming PC that they're tearing through Overwatch with or whatever you do in your free time. Lastly, I felt I would be remiss if I gave this talk and didn't talk about the things that got me here. There's a lot of people debating the efficacy of diversity, and I get a lot of compliments on how I present myself. That is because of the things that supported me. So I encourage you to support diversity and take it seriously. I am only standing in front of you because I had Black and Latino scholarships to take advantage of, need-based financial aid, and I was able to do things like the McNair Scholar Program that allowed me to travel across the country and present my research even as an undergrad. These are programs that support people, put people in rooms where they can make a difference. I hope you guys like talking with me and coming to these meetups. They mean a lot to me. Thank you. You can check out my GitHub there, left right there. 23 minutes. Cool. Questions? Yes.
So this is really cool, the presentation. If you had been in a job that, say, was using a different framework like Cypress, would you have been able to do something close?
I don't know. I'm actually working on a Medium blog post for this blog. In that, I do talk about that. It's like I wagered some of these patterns are doable, maybe not as clean. I don't know. In Cypress, the project that I'm on right now has some tests in Cypress, and I do kind of want to see if I can make it happen with Cypress, but we're in the process of refactoring to Playwright, so kind of defeats the purpose. The short answer, you probably can do it. And if you do use Cypress or Selenium or whatever at work, I encourage you to try doing it. That's the best thing about design patterns and functional approaches is they are not language or framework exclusive. So if you can mock that kind of stuff, if you can generate those kinds of contexts, those kinds of configurations and modulate your browser engines, I encourage you to give that a whirl with Cypress. Yes.
So Playwright's website claims that they create non-flaky E2E tests, but you mentioned flakiness. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Flakiness was me, not them, to clarify. I broke my app. Okay. So that's why I have a bunch of tests that run every single time I push my code. Like every time I push something to a branch on DeadDrop, I'm making sure that the core functionality that I advertise to people as an open source tool is not breaking. So no, the flakiness is usually a user error.
Love that they promise that though, because that's usually the.
I don't think anyone should promise that, quite frankly. Like, but I
can write an app that will guarantee a flaky test.
there you go. Exactly.
That's the end of it.
They haven't had determined enough engineers, is what they haven't had. Yeah, good question. Yes.
No, like, does Playwright ship the 4 browser binaries?
It downloads it when so yeah, there's a Playwright install call that you can do. It's actually, so like the pipeline that runs those tests, before it runs Playwright tests, it does Playwright install, and it downloads a bunch of zips, installs the binaries. You can limit which ones you want to install. Like I said, depending on the operating system you're on, you might not be able to install all of them. DeadDrop's pipelines run on Mac pipelines because I don't want to shard them. So like, for example, if you like check out the GitHub actions that deploy and run DeadDrop, they're all running Mac images, Mac Docker images, so that it can do WebKit. If you find a way to do WebKit on Linux or Windows, let me know. But that's how that's being tested. That was an easier solution than I was expecting, but I also don't really like that solution. But you know, whatever. There was there's a question over here. Yeah.
That AI become more prominent on applications. Have you thought about how you could use Playwright or any other framework?
Yeah. There's some example projects out there that combine LLMs and like generative AI with Playwright. I think it'd be fun to like throw an agent at a Playwright library and see if it could hack a site. Like, but I don't know. Playwright already has some pretty user-friendly like extra features. Like one I was just discussing with Brian earlier is like you can run a command and then it spits out the web app and you use it and it records those interactions and then it writes the test for you. I know. Isn't that dope? It's ridiculous. Like I thought that was really cool. I couldn't use that for DeadDrop very easily. I guess I could have on one side and then recorded it for the other, but I wanted to try writing it from scratch. But yeah, you can record them and generate the code, which is really nice. If you decide to start trying to hack websites with AI and Playwright, you probably could. I wish you luck. Yes.
Is it possible to have like, you know, multi-user testing with say a Chrome browser and a native app at the same time with Playwright, or is that going?
That is definitely, I would say, out of the scope of what I've explored. I don't know if there's any Playwright adapters for things. I could see there being like a React Native fork or something, where someone found a way to like source map and trace like how the React Native view, because React Native isn't a true native app. It emulates a web view, and so you can parse that. And there's ways, and I've written end-to-end automations for React Native before, but not with Playwright. I would be interested to see like if someone was able to do that. But again, I think it would depend how you built the app. If it was true native versus like PWA versus web app, or like a hybrid, like a React Native or a Cordova. I wager you could probably do a Cordova app with all the tags. I don't know. Try it. Let me know. Any other questions? Yes.
What dead drop feature are you most proud of?
Oh, I appreciate that question. That's really nice. What dead drop feature am I most proud of? I'm most proud of the fact that it got me a slot at a conference. I really enjoyed that. I am building cloud synced local first vaults right now, so that you can swap your entire .env with one command and not have to manage secrets. That's what I think I'm most excited about. That's in active development. That and multi-drop. Right now it's 1-to-1. I'm adding support so you can drop to up to 3 or 5 people depending on whether or not you're signed in. That's probably the feature that I get requested the most. All the people that have tried it will ping me and be like, hey, I got to be able to drop to more than one person. I go, okay, make a PR. I'm the only contributor to dead drop, needless to say. Yes.
I have a question. So if you mention features.
Yeah.
To prepare your test, like set up everything.
Mhm.
But I think that something can be possible if to done into global setup file. I don't know the difference. So I know that it's possible to do the same thing in global setup and features.
Okay.
So what's the difference between them and what I need to use?
For sure.
Features.
Yeah. So why would you, if I'm understanding your question correctly, is why would you implement something as a fixture as opposed to using your root config? Like the global config?
I call
Yeah.
global setup in Playwright, but I don't know what's the definition of global setup. I work only with features.
That's
Why like I prefer features because I prefer
yeah.
function way. It's like
Yeah.
very more, as you say, it's my approach.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I would say you can write whatever you want for the most part, but I would say that I reach for fixtures for things that are test scenario specific. For example, that fixture is only helpful if I'm doing a 1-to-1 drop. When I finish the Volt system or I finish multi-drop, that's useless. Like I would need to write another fixture or something like that. So I would recommend if for every unique starting use case, you could create a custom fixture. And then that would be like and if you, I don't know if you noticed, but I'm gonna do all that. The fixture is what you call when to define the test. So instead of calling test and passing your test body as a callback, you call the fixture result. So you can easily define fixtures and then kind of like hot swap them out and only use them like where you want to. Does that make sense?
Yeah, fixture is just an extension of your test. So it's
Yes, it is.
famous proxy in JavaScript, for example.
Yeah.
It's just wrapping your test and adding additional functionality.
Precisely. Yeah.
So, for example, if I need to do a login as you showed with the cookies or whatever with token, I should define it in global setup and do it once. And after
Brian and I have been debating this with people on our project. I would say if you can generate credentials and just shim them into your storage, do that. I am a big believer in testing things that need to be tested. If you are logging into your app every single time you're testing a given feature, you are testing login every single time. To which I would ask you why.
Through the login, right? Everything you are testing.
It depends on well, I don't know. I would argue if you're not testing login, you don't need to be running the login experience in order to do your test. You're not testing the login, you're testing the feature. Like have another test that tests the login. That's what that's there for. Like, but what you need to do is not, I mean, then you're also just like slamming your auth server. Like you're just using more resources. Like yeah, anyway, I was literally having this debate last week. Did that kind of answer your question?
So I just want to log in once.
Yeah.
And where I need to do it in features or in global development.
If you only want a single config, you'd be fine doing global. You can do what I did with fixtures in the global.
Save my login state somewhere in a storage state. Yeah.
No.
Where?
No, you'd need to. No, you would need to cache that in a file in a local variable. Yeah. Like so that it doesn't persist across like the projects array that you saw of the different configs that get swapped in to run each test. Nothing persists across those, and that's good. To clarify. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, yeah, so
Between unit test and end-to-end test, you still write unit test?
I added unit tests to dead drop a couple months ago. I built it 2.5 years ago. Don't judge me, but and that was because I was like, I need to make sure I don't break anything. And while unit tests are good and you should write them, I have to say that as an architect. But end-to-end tests give you more confidence, like in what your user's doing and stuff like that. So you want as much test coverage as you can, but I enjoy writing end-to-end tests more. I enjoy writing tests with Playwright. I let Copilot write my unit tests as much as possible. There was another question. Yeah.
Other cybersecurity overfix that happens to know vice president, president of 4 or 5.
I'm happy to chat about it. There is a presentation that I mentioned I did a go-to that is just on dead drop. This one I wanted to use dead drop as a case study because it's a good example and it's how I did this. Yeah, let's chat. I'd love to. Well, I'm laughing because I know that all my leaders are so happy right now that I was just asked what I do with AI. I have a significant amount of experience with LLMs and generative AI patterns for yes. Yeah, so I've built a lot of different chat apps. One of the talk that I gave last year at this meetup was about writing your own textable AI assistant. So I use AI every day. I do not think that you should sell your soul to it. That's all I will say. You all probably use AI every day. You probably just don't realize it. And so I like Copilot. I use the editor that I was showing. That's Windsurf. That's the AI editor from Codium. I just have some preferences for that one over Cursor. I like it. It's not the end of the world yet. So, yeah. Any other questions? Sweet. Thank you guys.